Hello YouTube. After the video from last week where I pretty much summed up why tonnage is the most important metrics, in this hypertrophy series I'm going to detail its utilization. And I'm going to draw from every single concept I've ever presented because, as I explained, they all tie and are all tied to tonnage. So, when it comes to progression and muscular development over time, I understand that a lot of people get confused because there are so many concepts and principles that at some point it feels like you're just completely lost, that everyone else is giving you a different definition or a different goal. To me, that's not true. To me, there's always an objective way to get bigger, and that is going to be mostly the application of patience. And the value that represents patience is tonnage. And its accumulation over time is what is going to result to growth as long as it takes place within the windows that I describe in this series. But now let's talk about the way to actually do it, because it's nice to know when it's going to work, how to make it work, but in practice, year after year after year, how do you do that? Well, first off, you're going to do it with a program that is going to encourage set repetition and multiplication. So for bodybuilders, for example, for a lot of lifts, I would highly recommend you pick a weight that is maybe a little bit smaller, but that allows you to do more reps and sets. And that sort of seems evident for a lot of people, but it goes beyond simply programming for it. It's also within progression, meaning that if you set up a rep range with a lift, you should make sure that when you add weight to that bar, the rep range is not going to shrink dramatically. That is only acceptable for strength work. Going from one set of 2 to 3 sets of 3 to 4 at the end, and then going back to a set of 2, a single set of 2, is acceptable for that because it's the opening of the workout and it makes up a small portion of the tonnage. So when you actually cut down that tonnage, the loss is not that major. But if the rest of the program is like that, you're going to run into trouble. And so for the rest of your programming, for your backup sets, for your variations, I suggest static sets. Or if they're not static, they vary by 1 or 2. So it's good to have a backup set that is going to be 3 to 4 sets. That way you know that you're always going to get a good amount of volume on that. And when you progress on it, it's still going to be that. So not only do you have a static amount of volume, but it's going to force you to be patient with the weight bump. Because you know that, hey, next week, I'm going to have to reproduce that effort with more weight. How much am I going to put on the bar? How am I going to program around it? Do I need to cut some strength work beforehand to be able to do that? That is sort of what the 5x5 and 3x5s do. They force you to be conservative because you know, hey, I did 5x5, but next week I do another 5x5. Issue is, most people who do it are novices and they don't have that ability. But for people who are more advanced, it makes total sense. Doesn't mean that you need static rep ranges, you can still do evolving rep ranges, but always within mind the fact that repeating the sets is most important. To me, it's something that I worked towards because I've always been limited by my ability to reproduce effort. I would do a set of 4 with a given weight, I would get the 4, but then if I tried to do the set again after 3 or 4 minutes, I could only get 2 or 1. And to me, that showed that I had an issue. I had an issue that was going to become a problem down the line because it was hurting me when it came to accumulating tonnage. And so I worked towards finding a way to progress within the program that would allow me to do that. And so now, and it's something that I recommend you do too, if I have scheduled 3 sets on an exercise, I'm doing 3 sets with the same weight. I never pyramid down, it's the same weight on the bar, and always within rep ranges that are similar. So if I could get 10 on the first set, I better get 9 or 8 on the second and 8 or 7 on the third. If I don't, I think about it and I see it as a mistake and as a failure on my part because I didn't accumulate the tonnage I wanted. So that's one portion of tonnage. And then you're going to have to also deal with the fact that since you're always to constantly try and accumulate that tonnage, there's going to need to be cuts here and there. And it's something I've already discussed when I speak about tonnage sacrifice. You do not need to be afraid of doing that. The bigger the vat of tonnage is that you accumulate each week, the easier it is for you to cut a portion because the percentage it represents for the mass is smaller. That's also the reason why having a large amount of lifts in your program that give you that tonnage is a massive benefit. because it allows for those sacrifices to happen. And it's also the reason why I preach against minimalism for people who are at the intermediate, late novice stage, is because when you're minimalistic, you cannot cut down anything, because anything you cut down, it represents too much of a portion of your training, so you can't. And the same exists in my training advice, but that's only strength folk. Strength folk is the one aspect that you cannot cut, because when you program, you need to have cornerstones, you need to have bases, and the basis of the program is the strength folk, but anything that comes afterwards is expendable, and it should be expendable because it gives you that freedom. And the freedom exists for one purpose only, to keep you patient and going. Because as you understand, tonnage accumulation cannot be the work of weeks or months, not even years. Because if you look at it objectively, what does that value represent? It represents effort, intelligence in the way you program it, but most importantly, time. The value of time is not discussed enough on YouTube Fitness. The chronological approach is key, because regardless of how much volume you do, how much intensity you do, if you do it for 2 years versus if you do it for 10 years, there's going to be a massive difference in results. There's going to be a massive difference in progression and overall accumulation. And it's a topic I'm going to be touching upon when I make a video discussing bodybuilding versus powerlifting and the way the trainings should happen, and also when I sort of expose my thoughts about strength blocks and hypertrophy blocks, which to me for bodybuilders are not necessary and can even be detrimental. Because we're talking about two completely different approaches and pursuits. The powerlifter is going to try and go from weight to weight to weight to weight to reach a peak. So if you try and visualize it, that's what the powerlifter does. They peak here because they know for a fact that after this, they're going to go straight down and repeat that. And next time they do it again, they want to peak higher and repeat that, etc. That works extremely well for strength. That's the way to program for strength. But if you look at it from a tonnage perspective, it's not that great. And it's the reason why their strength doesn't correlate with their size. A bodybuilder does the exact opposite. The goal is not to get super high, super fast. The goal is to get super far as slowly as it takes you with a progression that never ceases. So the powerlifter is here, you're here. Okay, now they're here, they deloaded, you're still going. They're here. They're always going to be stronger than you, always. But in terms of tonnage, you'll be further, which means your size will not correlate with your strength. You'll be much bigger than your size indicates. And that's also dependent on leverages, etc. But if your true pursuit is bodybuilding, that's the way you should be thinking about it. And it also means that powerlifters and bodybuilders exist in two different timelines. We're neighbors, but we don't live in the same house. And that is key, because too many people, it's sort of sad to say, but it's like they're living with diverse parents, where they spend 1 week at parent A, which is bodybuilding, 1 week at parent B, which is powerlifting, because their training is all over the place. It's strength here, hypertrophy there. It should all be hypertrophy. Strength pursuit with strength work is a byproduct of it. It exists strictly to drive hypertrophy, not as a value that just bolsters itself. You don't get stronger as a bodybuilder just to get stronger. You do it to push tonnage progression over time. And that's your only reason. And so again, when you compare those two stats and those two graphs of the powerlifter and bodybuilder, you see that the approach to chronology is completely different. Because for powerlifters, it's going to be a cycle that repeats itself. So in reality, it would be more like this, where they're going high, deload, and higher and higher and higher until they're in their prime, basically, and then it tapers down. And so that's the reason why they have blocks. That's the reason why deloads make a ton of sense for them, but not for bodybuilders. For bodybuilders, it's going to be a slow escalation. And understand that any break you take, any approach that you're going to have that is going to result in massive dips in tonnage, all of that in reality is making you yo-yo in terms of progression for no clear results. Because yeah, you might peak in strength, but what was the goal behind that? It didn't make you peak in tonnage. And that's the issue. That's what needs to be avoided. And it's the reason why, to me, a good way to just avoid that completely is to just not think about strength, not think about even intensity or volume, but just think about tonnage. And when you think about tonnage, all of the other approaches become evident because they're all leading to it. So if you want to be able to have that accumulation, you need to understand them. And that's what I'm going to end this video on. The topic of tonnage, I think, is covered now. I have the video where I define it, the video where I explain why it's a good metric to follow, and now this one where I give you the approach that I personally do. And if you want to hear more about the several approaches, you can check the Natural Hypertrophy playlist. I sort of explain my philosophy in there. And you can expect more videos in the Hypertrophy series where I talk about all of those other variables that all connect to tonnage. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.